Think about this. There was a study that came out shortly after the election. They were doing these studies to figure out what were the factors that were most highly correlated with Trump's support. And there were a lot of them, and they're hard to sort of disentangle. Sometimes they interact with each other. But one of the most highly correlated factors at the community level with Trump's support, at the like county by county level, was the level of opioid addiction in that county. The more people addicted to opiates, the more white folks in particular, addicted to opiates, the higher the level for Trump. Now, please don't misunderstand. I'm not saying that you had to be high to vote for Donald Trump. That's not actually my argument. Though it's a fascinating sociological query that the academics in the room might want to engage. Whatever. Good luck with that research. That's not my point. My point is that what is an opiate? Think about it. What is an opiate? Pharmacologically, just like its most basic pharmacological purpose is to do one thing, block pain, right? That's all it does. It doesn't solve the problem. If you got a crushed disc in your back, you're gonna need surgery. The opiate is not gonna fix your back, but it will get you through, theoretically, until you can get the actual problem solved. Same thing with cancer. They might put you on opiates, right? But that's not gonna solve the cancer. You're gonna have to have some other stuff done. So it's sort of like when Donald Trump comes along and says, I got a solution for your pain, that doesn't really speak to the problem. He's like a walking, talking, breathing human opiate, right? And it's killing the very people who take it, right? There's this study came out 2 years ago, found that there's been this huge increase in deaths in white communities, working class, non-college educated, middle-aged white folks, right? An excess death rate in those communities from suicide, opioid addiction, and heavy drinking that causes cirrhosis of the liver, right? Not natural causes, these are self-inflicted wounds. And it's happening in white space, not black and brown space in the same way. In the black and brown spaces, even though the death rates are higher, don't get me wrong, they're headed in the right direction. They're going down. The mortality rates are getting better. In the white community that I just described, they're getting worse. Why? Well, it's not because whites are hurting worse than people of color. Like I said, unemployment, poverty, wealth, any category you want to look at, white folks are better off than people of color, even though millions are struggling. The point is, white folks have been promised this. And if I've been promised this and I'm only getting this, I got to numb the gap between that because I don't know how to deal with that. See, people that never had any expectations learn how to struggle, right? If you never had any expectations, if you always knew that life was a hustle and you're going to have to grind to get where you got to get, then you don't give up when you run up against that wall. But if you were told that you didn't have to hustle, that all you had to do was work hard and play by the rules which people like you, after all, created, and then you hit that wall, you go crazy. You don't know how to deal with that. Well, you told me my life would be an 8 and it's only a 5.5. Oh, hell no, see? So I got to either take you out or I got to take myself out, which is to say that this privilege of expectations that the dominant group has had is really unhealthy. It's good as long as it all works out, right? But when the economy changes and it doesn't work out for a lot of people, it becomes a self-destructive thing. That notion that where you end up is all about you, uninterrogated, becomes a dagger pointed at the very heart of the people who created that myth in the first place. Back in April of 2011, there was a cover story in Newsweek, and they were interviewing these white guys who were like managers. These weren't even like working class, these were managers, right? And they'd lost their jobs in the recession. Some of them had been out of work for like a year, and they were freaking out, and they're walking around looking for jobs, and this one guy's interviewed, and he says, every time I'm out looking for a job, I feel like I've got a neon sign around my neck that says, unemployed lazy bum. And I remember thinking to myself, man, who told you that unemployed people were lazy bums? I know who didn't tell you, unemployed people. I'll tell you who else didn't tell you, black folks. I'll tell you who else didn't tell you, people of color generally. You know who told you that unemployed people were lazy bums? You told you. And people like you told you that they were lazy bums. And so the very ideology that you rocked all those years thinking that it would never come back to bite you on the ass has now come back to bite you on the ass, which is to say you'd have been better off to just listen to people of color from day one. Because they could have told you the system was a scam from the time that they were 12. They could have told you that it was a setup. They could have told you that it was a ripoff. They could have told you that it was a hoax, but we didn't want to believe it. And now we're the ones who are the least prepared for change. That's why you see these videos on YouTube, right, of like this white guy in Starbucks that has this meltdown because he got like bad service from a barista who happened to be black. Check this out. Go look for it. Look for white dude Starbucks meltdown. It'll come up. This guy's going just nuts because he got his latte with soy milk or something and I don't know. And he's yelling at her and he starts using racial slurs against this black barista and throws out there, I voted for Trump. What do you think about that? I don't know, why the hell is that relevant to your order? Right? He just wanted to say it just to like bust it off on her, and so he's yelling at her, using racial slurs, and then he goes on later to tell he feels oppressed. Look, here's the thing. If you think bad service at a coffee joint is oppression, you clearly have never experienced oppression, all right? If you think that bad service at the Starbucks is being oppressed, you've just proven white privilege. I don't even have to give my damn talks. I could just come up, show you that clip and be like, that shit right there, that's what I'm talking about, right? But this obliviousness is dangerous, right? Because that dude's having an existential crisis precisely because he's never had to come up against the idea that maybe his life wasn't going to work out quite the way he thought it was.
Now, what we are seeing going on in America right now is not new. It's not new. It might feel new to some people. It might feel uncomfortable to some people, but it's nothing new. That's exactly what Tim Weiss is trying to teach us in this video. The economic instability, the political extremism, the police brutality, the immigration crackdowns, the unaffordable cost of living is nothing new in this country, especially to some, many people. It only feels new if you have been protected from it. And that protection has always been racial. For generations, many black people, for instance, and minorities have been living in what many white Americans are now just beginning to experience. And that's exactly what, Tim Weiss has been trying to explain. Trump did not invent the current day, chaotic America. No, he has just exposed it, or he has just amplified it, and now that the very system that shielded white America, is beginning to crack, the truth is beginning to also be, become exposed over and over and consistently. Now, that's what we were going to talk about in this video. We have a lot to learn from this particular video from Tim Weiss. So let's go straight into this video, and I'll be back with some good lessons at the end of this.
I find it interesting, in the introduction there, the president mentioned James Baldwin, and I'm going to do that as well, because I, as well as he, have a great regard for Baldwin, and I think that sometimes, particularly for those of us who are white and do this work, it's really important for us, whenever possible, to point both backwards and forwards and next to us to those persons of color who have done so much of the hard and heavy lifting over the years when it comes to fighting white supremacy and racism. And Baldwin certainly did more than his share of that. And in particular, Baldwin was especially prescient and important in the way that he understood how the past affects the present and how our understanding of the past is critical in terms of our ability to understand where we are as a country right now, right? The idea that if you don't understand sort of what came before now, whether we're talking about our politics and the current administration, or whether we're just talking about any subject related to race, and I would actually go further and say any subject anywhere. If you don't understand what came before, you can't really make sense out of what you're seeing right now. He was especially critical of the way that white Americans often had this sort of hagiographic, horribly inaccurate understanding of our history and how it affected our ability to understand the world that we perceived. This is what he said over half a century ago. Speaking of white folks, he said, people who imagine that history flatters them, as it does indeed since they wrote it, are impaled on their history like a butterfly on a pin and become incapable of seeing or changing themselves or the world. This is where it appears most white Americans find themselves today, impaled. They are dimly or perhaps even vividly aware that the history they have fed themselves is mainly a lie, but they do not know how to be released from it, and they suffer enormously from the resulting personal incoherence. Now, first off, damn, that is such a brilliant statement that I could sort of be done. Like, if this mic were a droppable mic, I could just pick it up, drop it, walk out the door, and be like, I'm done. But they're paying me for a full hour, and I have more to say. But honest to God, that one paragraph from James Baldwin, what is he saying, right? He's saying that people who have the luxury and the power to have written the history with no real understanding of what it was, right, can't even see themselves in the world, let alone understand the world that they find, and they actually suffer because of it. It's not only the suffering of those whom they denigrate and step upon, but even themselves, they become incomprehensible to themselves. You cannot understand what comes today if you don't understand what came before. And look, that's not just about race. It's true in your own life, isn't it? If you don't understand the dysfunctions, the pathologies, the messed upness, which is not really a word, but, we all can relate to what it means, the messed upness of your own family. If I can't do that with my own family, then I can't understand my own damage, right? The damage that I don't want to pass on to my own children. If I want to be a better parent, I got to know where my parents screwed up, as well as understand what they did right? So whether it's good or bad, you got to know from whence you come. Right. The problem is we don't do that very often. And when we don't do it, we create a very dangerous world in terms of our ability to work together and build justice. Let's think about a few contemporary examples, right, to understand what I mean. And I'll talk a little bit about the election and political context in a minute, but I want to start somewhere else because I don't want to give this particular moment, this particular man, this particular administration any more credit for creating this problem than he deserves, because this thing has been around since long before Donald Trump. This thing has been around long before Trumpism, right? We can't give all the credit there. It's not like Donald Trump thought up some new stuff. Right? It's not like Donald Trump created the problem. This is a problem that goes back to the founding of our country. So we'll get to that. But I want to start somewhere else. If you don't understand, for instance, the history, the predicate, what came before, when it comes to the subject of law enforcement misconduct in black and brown communities, for instance, right? If you don't know that history because it was never taught to you, right, then a movement like Black Lives Matter won't make sense to you. If you don't understand the way that black life has been discounted and denigrated and has not mattered institutionally to an awful lot of folks, right, then somebody proclaiming that Black Lives Matter will seem irrational. It will seem horribly militant and separatist and maybe even hateful. And then you'll say things like, but what about my life? What about me? All lives matter, don't they? What about me? I know, precious. I know your life matters. I know my life. You don't have to tell me that all lives matter. I get that. I got 2 children. I got 2 teenagers. They're 15 and 13. They are white. That is what happens when white people make babies. You get white babies. They are white. I know that their lives matter. You don't have to tell me. I don't need a bumper sticker to remind me of the value of my own children's lives. The point is, every cop in this country also knows that my daughter's lives matter. And every teacher knows, and every employer knows, and every bank loan officer knows. That is to say, we don't have to specify about my daughters. Their lives and the value of their lives are taken for granted. You only got to specify that which gets routinely ignored. You only have to specify that which we tend to forget, because remember, white folks have a long history of saying all and not meaning it. We do. Thomas Jefferson, now, he's not representative of all white people, but I gather he's one of white people's favorite white people. Thomas Jefferson said, did he not, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There's that word all, as in all lives matter, all men are created equal. But when Thomas Jefferson wrote those words, he owned over 250 other human beings, so I'm guessing he didn't really mean it. But he said it, right? And when the Pledge of Allegiance was written, first iteration in the 1880s, there were several afterward through the 1920s, last iteration, last version, 1954. But in every iteration of the pledge, what's that last line? That never changed. With liberty and justice for whom? All, there's that word again, written by white folks who I dare say in 1888 or whatever it was, did not mean it. Nor did they mean it in the 20s, nor did they mean it in the 50s. So what black folks are trying to tell us with BLM, whether we're prepared to hear it or not, is that when y'all have been forgetting that we're part of the all, we're gonna have to remind you. And Black Lives Matter becomes that asterisk at the end of white folks all. As in, yeah, y'all need to be reminded from time to time that you've been forgetting some folks. Now, we can certainly make the argument that we got to be clear that indigenous lives matter and Latinx lives matter and Asian Pacific Islander lives matter, because those are too often discounted as well. But trust me when I tell you that in this country, when black lives finally do matter at the institutional and systemic level, all of our lives will, and not one moment before that, see? But if you don't know the history of misconduct, nothing I said will make sense to you, because for a lot of white folks, we have grown up in a society where the police really were the protectors. We just had a different relationship to law enforcement than a lot of people of color have. This isn't about bad cops, good cops, by the way. It's not about, oh, all police are terrible, all police are racist, all police are brutal. It's not about people, it's about systems, right? And law enforcement as a culture has a history of abuse, and every Angelino who is black and brown knows that. Everyone in this greater area who is black and brown knows that. Everybody's been in Pasadena long enough knows that, right? Black folks, for instance, know that modern policing traces directly to slave patrols. That's the first iteration of policing in this country, right? And there's a bright line relationship between that and what came next. Cops were the ones who enforced the slave laws. Cops were the ones who enforced segregation. Cops were the ones who collaborated with riots in black neighborhoods, burning them to the ground in the 20s and 30s. Cops were the ones who collaborated with military uniformed officers in Los Angeles in 43 during the Zoot Suit riots when they rampaged in Chicano neighborhoods. And Chicano folks in this area know that history. A lot of white folks weren't taught it. And you can't know what you weren't taught, and you can't teach what you don't know. So I'm not saying you ought to feel bad for not knowing it. I'm just saying when you don't know some stuff, you miss some stuff. When you have the luxury of being oblivious to that history, you miss some stuff. People of color don't have the same luxury. They know that it was cops that pulled protesters off of the stools during the sit-ins in the South where I'm from. That wasn't done by random folk off the street. That was cops with guns and badges and the power of the state. See, here's the problem. Whether you're a good person or a bad person and you become a police officer, I think most people who become cops, most people who become teachers, most people who become whatever they become are good people. I think most people are good folks, just in general. I think most people don't wake up wanting to hurt other people, but here's the problem. If you have a job that involves enforcing the law in a society where the law is the problem, right? Let me repeat. If you have a job to enforce the law in a society where the law itself is the problem, that is to say segregation as a law, enslavement as a law, indigenous removal as a law, right? The dislocation and dispossession of Latinx peoples from their land, where that's a law, where Japanese internment is a law, right? Then the people whose job is to enforce that law by definition are agents of injustice. That's not about hating police. That's just obvious, right? If you are the enforcer of the system and the system is the problem, then you are part of the problem. If you want to be part of the solution, you got to flip that system, right? You can't stand at the end of the conveyor belt in the factory marked sausage factory and be shocked when all the stuff it sends you is sausage. If you're sitting down there and you're like, where the hell are my chicken nuggets? You clearly did not read the sign, yo. It said it was about sausage. So you probably ought to understand the system is contributing and producing exactly what it was intended to produce, right? And if you understand the history, that doesn't sound radical. It just sounds obvious, right? But if you don't know that history, it seems absurd. So you got to understand the past to understand the present. That's the point. But it's not just with regard to policing, right? It's with regard to just any inequities that you see. And I think about this not as an educator, not as a writer, not as a scholar, activist, or anything. I think about this as a dad, right? Because like I said, I got these two girls, they're 15 and 13. And, you know, when you're a parent, you always sort of pay real close attention to how your kids learn stuff, right? And you can see, like, when the light bulb goes on over their head, and it's sort of a really amazing moment because you're like, oh, my God, they just figured out something, and it's sort of cool, and, you know, you try to commit that to memory. All right, so a couple years ago, I'm driving with my girls to their dance studio. They're dancers, and we were leaving their school to drive to the studio, about 8 minutes on surface streets in Nashville, Tennessee, from their school to the downtown studio, where they were both in the company. And it's a drive we've made every day, virtually every day for like a year and a half during the week and once on weekends. So we're used to this drive. But on this particular day, something different happened. We get stopped at a red light. And that red light happens to be in the middle of public housing, right? Both sides of the street, public housing apartments, or what we refer to in this country as projects, right? And the 10-year-old daughter, whose name is Rachel, sitting in the back seat, looks around, and I'm sure she had recognized the racial demographic of that neighborhood before, because we've been making the drive every day, right? But that day she says, "Daddy, why is this neighborhood pretty much all black?" Oh, that's a hell of a good question, right? I mean, that's a really deep, like my kid, my 10-year-old is doing like urban anthropology in the back of my Highlander, y'all. That's like some pretty serious stuff. Like I was very proud too, you know, because after all, this is what I do, right? And she's like noticing stuff and I'm like, oh, I'm so proud. And I'm real happy because it's like the one question she could have asked me that I actually know the answer to, right? Because when you're a parent, your kids will ask you all kinds of crazy shit that you have no idea how to answer. Like if my daughter had said, "Daddy, where does electricity come from?" I'd have been like, "Psh, Google it. I have no idea." I didn't pay attention in that class. But the one about how this neighborhood got black, I know that. That's the one. And so I'm all excited. I got the answer ready. I can't give her the PhD level answer because we only got 4 minutes left before we're at the studio, right? So I know I got to cut it down. I got to make it sort of easy. You know, I got to make it digestible, right? So I've got the thumbnail version, though. It's right here in my throat. It's about to come out. And then something happened that I didn't know was going to happen because I'm an only child, right? I didn't know this was a thing, but those of you who are not only children will instantly recognize what I mean. Apparently, when you have an older sibling, and you are in the presence of that older sibling, and you ask a question of your parent, right? And the older sibling hears the question, they will inevitably, and without very much hesitation, offer up their own damn answer, right? Just to show how smart they are, right? And so Rachel says, remember the question, why is this neighborhood pretty much all black? And Ashton, the 12-year-old, without missing a beat, as I'm getting ready to offer the answer, jumps up and says, redlining, which is scary-ass accurate if you know the history. And if you don't, you're about to. I was like, what? How did you know that? Have you been reading my books? Like, what? Is it genetic? Do you just know shit? Is it passed down generationally to you just because daddy knows? That's crazy. It was creepy. And the 10-year-old said, I don't think I know what redlining means. I'm like, yeah, I don't think your sister does either, but that was a hell of a guess. Right? Now, here's the thing. To be honest with you, her answer is not quite right. She actually sort of got it twisted a little bit because redlining is not how it got black, but it is how it got poor. So she's sort of conflating race and class, but I'm going to give her half credit because, damn, she's 12 years old at the time. But let me just sort of explain to you what redlining is. Redlining is a thing that some of y'all will know what this is, but in any event, it was something that was very common. It was done as a matter of course all through this country, north, south, east, west, everything in between, where banks would take maps of neighborhoods and they would take a red marker and they would draw a line around black neighborhoods, and occasionally they would do the same with Latinx neighborhoods, but especially black neighborhoods. And anybody who lived in the boundaries of that neighborhood was not going to get a loan. You weren't going to get a business loan. You weren't going to get a mortgage loan, nothing. And it didn't matter if you had good credit, didn't matter. Didn't matter if you had a good job, didn't matter. Didn't matter if you had a good education, none of it mattered. You weren't getting a loan just because you lived in that space. And this was done generation in and generation out as a formal and totally legal above-board practice until 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed. But even after that, the research tells us it continued indirectly, sort of informally, secretly. The research today says we probably got 3 to 4 million cases of housing discrimination against people of color every year based on race. About half of those are in the mortgage market. The other half are in the rental market. So in other words, it's still happening. But it used to be totally legal. And as a result, right, that meant that those communities were starved of wealth. Those communities were starved of capital, right? Folks weren't able to start up businesses. And by the way, at the very same time they couldn't get those loans, they were knocking down neighborhoods to put up interstates and to put up shopping malls and to put up garages and office buildings. And most of the houses that got knocked down and apartments that got knocked down were being lived in by black and brown folks. 20% of all African-American housing in the country was knocked to the ground between 1950 and 1969 to make way for economic progress, highways, et cetera. right? So people of color were being denied capital, and the stuff they already had was being flattened by bulldozers, right? So that's how those neighborhoods became poor. But how did they actually become black, or black and brown combined, folks of color? Well, that happened for a couple of reasons that are really important to know. First of all, most people don't know this history, but like Baldwin said, if you don't understand it, right, then you're not going to understand what you see. That's the effect of what he was saying in that quote I started with. What happens is the public housing that we were looking at right there in Nashville, and this is true public housing nationwide, that was created not for people of color. Most people don't know this history, but you need to. Public housing was created for white folks. Right? For the first couple of years, it was very hard in most parts of the country for people of color to even get access to publicly subsidized housing. It was created for poor white folks to give them an opportunity, a leg up to come into the so-called middle class. But at the very same time that the government creates those public interventions in the housing market for white people, they also created some other programs that were sort of duplications of that, but even better. They create the FHA loan program, the VA loan program, later on the GI Bill program. In theory, these were open to everybody, but in practice, virtually all the benefits went to white folks because the criteria to qualify for these loans, which were government guaranteed loans without which you could not have gotten a house in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Virtually all the benefits went to whites because the underwriting criteria, the lending criteria, essentially excluded almost all people of color, with just a few exceptions. So in other words, the neighborhoods became racially identifiable because certain folks were able to hustle it out to the suburbs using those loans, right? Leaving the ones who couldn't get the loans in the city. And then you couldn't get a loan in the city because of redlining and other forms of discrimination. So these neighborhoods become white, these become black and brown, these become middle class to affluent, these become poor, not because of anything having to do with the people that live there, but having to do with the decisions made by people who most definitely do not live there, right? Now, I get to the end of that story and we're at the studio. I drop the kids off and I'm wondering, God, I hope they got it, you know? They seem to. They're nodding. They're, oh, yeah, okay. They seem to understand, yeah? And as I'm driving away, I think to myself, that's a really important story because what if my kids ask me that and I don't know the answer? What if your kids ask you and you don't? What if a child asks a teacher in a classroom and they don't because they were never taught it? Because were any of us really taught in K-12 about that process of racial discrimination? I wasn't. I wasn't taught in AP history, and hell, that's the history for smart people. That's what they tell you. That's the history where you can supposedly handle anything. Apparently not that, though. You can't handle that. So they don't tell you that, right? And if I don't know the answer, do you think my kid stops wondering about the question? No. See, my 10-year-old who wanted to know why the neighborhood looked the way it did, right, is going to keep wondering. But if she asks and I'm like, oh, I don't know, she's going to keep wondering, what do you think her conclusion is going to be? Because she's going to come to her own conclusion. And you know what that conclusion is going to be. The only one it can be in this culture. It's the conclusion that this society has already handed her on a silver platter. What is it? You know, because it's the conclusion that comes from the fundamental guiding ideology of our country, the thing that we've all been taught, the thing that we've all been exposed to, the secular gospel of America, the creation myth of America, Genesis 1:1 of America. And you know what it is. The Genesis 1:1 of this country is what? Wherever you end up is all about you. Right? Because if you just worked hard, you'd have made it. If you didn't make it, there's something wrong with you. You should have worked harder. The notion of rugged individualism, right? That's the fundamental building block of our country. But if you're taught that, and then you look around and you see this level of inequality, and you don't know the backstory of how we got that inequality, then you end up defaulting to the idea that these people are down here living like this because there's something wrong with them. And these people over here are up here living like this because they're superior. In other words, racism becomes almost rational unless you question that ideology. Just like sexism does, right? Because if you look around and you see men disproportionately on the hierarchy, right, and you see women disproportionately below them on that hierarchy, then it becomes almost logical for people, even women, to internalize a belief that they don't have the same capacity as men. Classism becomes rational. Where you look down even on poor white folks. You look down on poor white folks in coal country and Appalachia, and you go, well, you know, if they would just work harder, everything would be fine. We don't have to do anything to the job market or the larger economy because they're to blame. In other words, if we don't understand how we got from point A to point B to point whatever we're at now, we end up making conclusions that are fundamentally going to reinforce racism, sexism, and classism. And here's the thing. Every one of us knows that that myth is a myth. We know it's not about simple, rugged individualism. We all know people, do we not, who have worked hard their whole lives, got nothing to show for it. And we all know people who were born on third base and think they hit a triple, right? Never had to work hard, right? And they'll never lose what they've got. I'm even told, now this may be a rumor, y'all tell me, but I was told, as hard as this may be to believe, that there are even people who inherited their father's real estate empire in the 1970s, got to take over his real estate portfolio in the 1970s when it was worth $227 million already, and turned it into a few billion and decides that that makes him a self-made billionaire. Have y'all heard that story? I heard that story. I don't know who I'm talking about. I forget the name, but I feel like that's a thing, right? We know it's not about rugged individualism. It's about head starts, who had them and who didn't. It's about an 8-lap relay race where some folks started on lap 5, and some folks had to start at lap 1, and then were shocked when the ones with the 5-lap head start crossed the finish line first. That's what's supposed to happen when you have a 5-lap head start. Yes? Right? And so ultimately and look, the rugged, first of all, like even if you don't like my politics, can we just agree that there's no such thing as a rugged individual? That's like some crazy shit. Like really, truly crazy. Because what would that even entail? First of all, there's no such thing as an individual human being, right? Because humans have always lived in collectives. We are a social being. We're a social species. None of us were raised by ourselves on an island by a porpoise, right? We've had families, we've had tribes, we've had cultures, we've had nations, right? We've all been raised in a social context. None of us were raised by a porpoise on an island. If you ever actually meet someone who qualifies as a true rugged individual, for the love of God, you need to get the hell away from that thing, because it's going to be dangerous as hell. It's going to be like a feral animal. It's not going to have language, right? It's not going to know that it's not supposed to eat you because nobody ever told it that, right? Because it was a rugged individual being raised by the porpoise on the island. They see you, they're like, I'm just going to eat you. They don't know. Rugged individuals would be dangerous. You don't want them running your country. You don't want them running your business. You don't want them as neighbors, right? The good news is there aren't any such people. We've all had help. We've all been raised in a social context. We have to understand that context in order to understand how we arrived at our current position and at our current place, right? And it's very dangerous for us not to do that, right? It's dangerous when we think about the policing thing again. I can tell you right now, the only reason I'm standing here. See, if I'm going to ask you to think about that, how you ended up from point A to point B, I got to do the same. So I'll model the behavior I'm asking about. Because once again, this is where privilege comes in. This is where we have to understand the context of our own lives. I'm only standing here because the war on drugs is not about drugs, right? Going back to that issue of policing. I'm only here because the war on drugs isn't really about the thing it pretends to be about. What do I mean by that? I think you know what I mean by that. And I can tell you what I'm about to tell you because the statute of limitations has expired on this shit and they can't touch me now. I'm being quite serious. Keep in mind now, the reason I know the war on drugs isn't about drugs, two things. One is all the data tells me. Centers for Disease Control, National Institutes on Drug Abuse, every study you choose to consult says what? White folks are just as likely, if not more likely, to use drugs, just as likely, if not more likely, to possess drugs, just as likely, if not more likely, to sell drugs, just as likely, if not more likely, than people of color to become addicted to them, right? So the rates of usage, possession, dealing, and addiction equal or greater, depending on the age group, for whites relative to people of color. That's one way that I know. The other way is the fact that I'm here. Because in April of 1988, I was headed back from a college debate tournament. I was at Tulane University in New Orleans. We went to a debate tournament in San Antonio, driving a rental car back, right? And I get stopped in Gonzales, Texas. I do not recommend this, by the way. I get stopped in Gonzales, going about 13 miles an hour over the limit. So I pull over. It's just me, my debate partner, another two-person team, and the coach. And I'm nervous, right? And I'm nervous because I know what's in the car, other than debate evidence. I know that at that moment, in the briefcase of my coach, is the following: 1.5 ounces of weed, an 8-ball of coke, 12 sheets of acid. Yeah, Google it. And and 14 hits of X. Now, not bragging, by the way, and I'm not encouraging this behavior. Yeah, I'm not. I'm just asking you a fundamental question. You know what the question's going to be, but I got to keep setting this thing up. Now, for those who are not drug users, either now or at any point, that is not for personal consumption, as you can probably imagine. That would kill anyone who tried to do all that. So that was my coach. He was a dealer on the debate circuit. He would deal to other coaches. He would deal to debaters. Right? So I get pulled over, and I know that's in there. And I'm nervous as hell because he comes to the door with that flashlight, right? Puts it in the face, and he's like, I need to see your license. I'm like, of course. I'm looking for it. I'm looking for the damn thing. It's a wallet. It's got like 4 places it could be. Can't find the damn thing. And it seemed like it took 30 minutes. It was probably 20 seconds. But it seemed like it was a half an hour. I'm sweating, right? My eyes are getting big. I'm sweating crazy, just profusely. The air's on, doesn't matter. Sweating, right? And I just know that this is not going to go well. He says, would you like to come back and sit in the cruiser where the light's better? I'm like, okay. I go back there. He's right, man. The light is way better in the police car. So I'm looking for it. Right? And finally, I turn over this one little, flap where you put pictures and credit cards and stuff. And there's my fake ID. I got that. He sees it. He goes, isn't that it? I'm like, no. That's something else. I don't know. That's like a craft project. I don't know what the hell that is. I don't know, even though it said driver's license right on the damn top. And he saw it, and he's like, are you sure? And he starts to reach for it. And just as he starts to reach for it, now keep in mind, just the license alone is a misdemeanor offense, $500 fine, up to 60 days in jail potentially. Probably wouldn't have gone to jail for it, but they're going to search the car when he gets it, right? So he's reaching for it, and just as he does, I find my real license that magically reappears in a place that I thought I had searched 5 times. And I'm like, here it is. Oh, here it is, right? And he goes, you sure that's it? And he gave me a look that said he knew. He writes me a $75 ticket. He lets me go. Now, if you think that he wouldn't have searched that car with all the nervousness that I was exuding, the at least suspicious behavior that would suggest possibly something greater was up. If you don't think he would have searched that car if I were black or brown, you have not been paying attention. And I don't mean to this lecture. I mean to life in general in America, right? So see, that doesn't take away from whatever genuine abilities I have as a speaker or as a writer or as a scholar or as a whatever, right? But it means that every one of us is where we are because of a confluence of factors, some of which have to do with privilege that we didn't earn, some of which are just about luck. Because the other reason I'm standing here is even stranger than that one. The reason I'm really standing here is because right after I graduated from college, I got a job in Louisiana working against a white supremacist neo-Nazi former Klan leader named David Duke, who was running for the U.S. Senate and governor in Louisiana in 90 and 91. All right, I was involved in the campaigns against him. It was sort of a high-profile thing, so those of us who worked in that effort got a lot of attention, probably more than the person who's 23 years old typically would have doing this work. But the only reason I got to do that job was because I'd gone to Tulane and I met the 2 men who started that organization. If I go to any other college, I don't meet them, right? And the only reason I went to Tulane is because when I came out of high school, I was chasing a girl that went to Louisiana State. Right? That's the truth. Right? I'd never even thought of Tulane, but I meet this girl at a summer debate camp. I realize I'm totally like geeking out on debate right now, but you just got to understand these are important stories, central to my life. I was at a debate camp at American University in D.C. summer between junior and senior year. I meet this girl, and in the manner of a 16-year-old, I fall in love, right? And I tell her I'm going to go to Emory in Atlanta. That was where I was going to go. She's like, no, you can't go to Atlanta for college. We'll never see each other. You have to go to Tulane because then you'll only be an hour away, hour and 15. And then I'm like, oh, of course, I will completely change my entire life. Of course, that's what I'm going to do. Naturally, that's what I'm going to do. Screw my entire life plan. I'm following you because those relationships always work out. And I'm not bitter, by the way. It worked out really well for me and for her separately, but, But if I don't meet her and she doesn't convince me to go to Tulane, I don't meet those men. And if I don't meet those men who start that organization, I don't get that job. And if I don't get that job fighting David Duke, my whole life goes in a fundamentally different direction. But here's the thing. The only reason I met her was because I was a debater. If I hadn't been a debater, I wouldn't have done that. The only reason I was a debater was because, and that hadn't been my plan either. That hadn't been my path, at least I didn't think. When I was a kid, I thought my path was baseball. I was a really good baseball player. Not as good as Donald Trump now, because you've heard Donald Trump wants you to know he was the best baseball player in New York City in 1962. That happens to be a year that the Yankees won the World Series, but he was better than all of the players on the Yankees. He literally said this. So I wasn't Donald Trump good, but I was good. And I thought, I had college scouts come into my games when I was like 11 or 12, and so I thought, man, that's going to be my path. But then tried out for the high school team, had the most inexplicably horrible tryout in the history of tryouts. It's like I couldn't catch anymore, I couldn't throw, I forgot all the rules of the game. I get cut and had to find a different activity, which became debate. If I make that team, I'm not going to be debating, I'm going to be playing ball. If I'm not debating, I don't meet Monica at American University, I don't end up at Tulane, you know the rest of the story. What I'm really trying to tell you is I owe everything to that asshole that cut me from the baseball team. And to Coach Cantrell, I say thank you. Well played, because that ultimately made the difference. The point I'm trying to make is we got to challenge this notion of meritocracy. This idea that we end up where we are just because of our own hard work and our own effort, right? That's not true for me, as I've just proven. It's not true for any of us. Anywhere we get in life, we've had help. Some of it's been about race, some of it's been about gender, some of it's been about class, and some of it, like the baseball story, is just about luck, right? And if we'd be willing to own that, we'd be quite a ways further towards challenging racism, sexism, classism, and all these forms of inequality, because we wouldn't be looking down on folks who hadn't made it yet. Right? Because we could see ourselves in them and we could see them in us. It's only when we separate ourselves. Same thing is true with the immigration debate, right? Think about this. Our inability to understand the history of our own as white people, immigration is what gets us all twisted about brown folk coming, right? Because when Donald Trump gets up and says, well, Mexico, they're not sending their best. The hell, you think England sent their best? Y'all do know the best don't leave, right? The best sort of stay where they're at because they're winning. That's sort of the whole point. Like if you're the best, you ain't getting on the boat, right? I mean, the best are already, why the hell would they leave, man? They got everything they want. It's not like sometime around 1642, there's some British nobleman that gets his family together around the fireplace in the big castle and goes, all right, I've been giving this some thought, and I've consulted with your mom, not much, because it's like 1642, and I don't even have to ask her damn opinion. But we've been talking about it, and I think even though, I know you like the castle, right? It's great, right? I know, it's brilliant, it's great. I know, it's fantastic. You remember last weekend, we were at the King's? I know, right? You like the King's children, right? They're fabulous. I know you're out there riding on the ponies. We got all this gold. We do all these great things that rich people do in 1642. It's fantastic. But to hell with all that. I've got an idea. And we've decided that in 2 weeks from now, we're going to ask you to gather up your things. Just gather up your things. Just all that you can carry, nothing else. Just gather up your things. And we are going to get on a boat. A rickety old ship. I don't even know if it's seaworthy, to be honest. We might sink. We might be eaten by sharks. We might get scurvy or be hijacked by pirates. However, if we survive, I'm sure you'll agree that in a year hence, you'll be able to look back and say it was an excellent, fantastic adventure. Okay, that shit did not happen. The best did not leave because the winners always stay put. Only those who were suffering and losing in the system leave, and there's no shame in that. But there's no shame in it when English folk do it, and there's no shame when Mexican folk do it, and folks from Sri Lanka do it, and folks from Honduras and Guatemala do it, when folks from the continent of Africa do it. There's no shame when anybody gets up and says, I'm starting over. But see, the difference is black folks in this country know how they got here. And indigenous peoples know how they were here before, and Latinx folks, if they're in touch with the indigeneity of their heritage, also know that their people were here first. It's only European folks who apparently forgot that, as James Baldwin said, our ancestors didn't want to come either, right? We didn't want to, we had no choice. And if we understand that, it gets harder, doesn't it, to look down on folks, right? Because you understand what motivates them is the same, but we tell ourselves a lie. We say, well, we came for freedom. And they're just coming for stuff. The hell, we came for stuff. Land, we came for land, we came for opportunity, we came for a new start. Even if you came for quote unquote freedom, that would still be some stuff, but we didn't come for that. All you got to do is look at the kind of system we set up in the colonies. This is a pretty unfree system. We spent most of our time in the colonies oppressing each other for not being the right kind of Christian and trying to figure out who the witch was so we could kill her. It wasn't about freedom, right? It was about a new form of tyranny. So the reality is migration is always about the search for opportunity. People don't like to move, right? Folks from Mexico don't just cross the border and come here like for shits and giggles because they got nothing else to do, right? Nobody likes to move, man. I moved 5 years ago, 3 blocks, y'all. 3 blocks, and it damn near killed me. I was like, I'm never doing this again. I hate this. I told my wife, don't ask me to ever move. 3 blocks, and I was just done. Right? You think folks want to pick up and leave the country, the only country they know, their heritage, their language, their culture, their friends, family members, just to take advantage of some cheap-ass, inadequate health care and some low wages, and to be exploited and shot at in the desert for even making the attempt? The hell do we think people do? People do those things out of desperation. If we understand that, then the judgmentalism is a lot harder because, once again, I can see me in you and I can see you in me. So you got to understand your own past if you're going to understand other folks' present, because they're operating on the same motivations that we were. You understand? But this is not just an academic point. I want to suggest to you that it's bigger than that, and it's something that white folks better concern ourselves with, because I think sometimes we very easily, and I understand why, but it's a problem. We very easily and readily assume that the reason we got to change stuff up in this country and fix this problem is to save people of color. Well, here's the thing. Obviously, the impact of white supremacy on people of color is the first and foremost order of business, but it's not white folks' job to save black and brown people. Black and brown folks will liberate themselves from this system, whether we're with them or not. The question that I want white folks to ask is, who's going to liberate us from this system? Because it's doing a number on our mentality. It's doing a number on our humanity, and it's even dangerous for our health. Now, that may seem odd. How can a system that gives you advantages and benefits and opportunities actually be dangerous and bad for your health? Well, think about this. Go back to that point I made a few minutes ago about the notion of meritocracy and individualism, right? If I think, because I've been told, that wherever I end up is all about me, and I actually believe that, and then I find myself struggling, how do I make sense of that? See, when black and brown folks are told, hey, wherever you end up, it's your own fault, right? People of color sort of have enough of a history to know that that's pretty much bullshit, right? People of color have been around the block long enough to know that for the most part, it's always been more complicated than that. So folks of color always at least question that a little bit, if not a lot. But white Americans have been the group that's been able to sort of buy the myth, right? I'm not saying that white folks haven't struggled, but I'm saying that historically, white folks, even working class white folks, were able to say to themselves, listen, if I just play by the rules and I work hard and I keep my head down, and if I have a strong back and I can lift stuff, I'll always have a job. Right? Even those white folks in the coal mines who clearly don't have economic privilege, I mean, they're struggling. They're dying at 55 years old from black lung, occupational disease, and injury. So they're not economically privileged, but even they historically, right, were able to look around and at least say to themselves, hey, as long as I do everything right, my kid will be better off than I was, just like I was better off than my dad. Or they could say, well, my granddaddy worked in the mine, my daddy worked in the mine, I work in the mine, and my son's going to get a job in the mine when he graduates. But even the ability to take that for granted was sort of a privilege, wasn't it? Because folks of color have never been able to just say, oh, I'm sure there'll be jobs for me as long as I'm willing to work, right? Because people of color know that's not the way it's gone down. But if I'm a white person and you've promised me that as my birthright in this country, and then all of a sudden, I don't have a job. All of a sudden, the economy changes, right? And the assembly line shut down because the boss can make more money sending the jobs overseas, right? Or the coal mine shuts down, not because of regulations, not because of environmentalists, which is what they want us to believe, but because the guy that owns the coal mine learned that it's actually cheaper to just blow the top off a mountain with dynamite, right, and go in and get the coal that way than it is to actually use all the labor that they used to use. So it's about saving rich people money. And now these working class folks are out of work, can't find a job, 26 weeks, 52 weeks during the height of the recession. Some folks out of work 99 weeks, including millions of white folks who were told that would never happen to us, right? Now, if you tell me that's not going to happen to me, and now it does, and you tell me that wherever I end up is all about my own effort, I got two choices, don't I? I can either start to hate myself, right? And start to think that I'm the problem, that I'm just not good enough, right? That I'm not working good enough, that maybe my work ethic isn't good enough, that maybe I'm not smart enough, that maybe I'm not committed enough, that maybe I can't support my family. But that's hard to swallow, isn't it? It's hard to take that on. So my other option is I got to displace my anger and my anxiety and my frustration onto somebody else, right? So in other words, I'm dealing with all this self-doubt and all this pain. I got to find somebody to put the pain on. And then a politician comes along, and that politician says, I can take your pain and I can tell you who's to blame for it, and it's not you. Oh yeah, when those people on that side of town are out of work, it is their fault. But when you're out of work, it's also their fault, right? So you don't have to, that whole myth of meritocracy, that doesn't apply to you. And this stuff works, man. I got an email from a young guy a couple years back, young white guy, and that was his thing. He's like, I can't find a job because blacks and Mexicans are taking all the jobs. For real, all the jobs are being taken by black folks and Mexicans. Where the hell are these jobs at? Second Life, right? Are they on Minecraft or some shit, some video game? Like, where are these jobs? Because the data tells me that black folks with a college degree are still almost twice as likely as whites with a degree to be unemployed, no matter what their major, by the way. Tells me that Latinx folks with a degree are still 50% more likely than whites with a degree to be unemployed. That Asian American and Pacific Islanders with a degree are still 23% more likely than whites with a degree to be unemployed. That our indigenous brothers and sisters with a degree are 2/3 more likely than whites with a degree to be unemployed. So wherever in the hell people of color are taking all these white jobs, they're not taking them far, right? Plus, it's sort of weird, isn't it, when people say, they took my job. Well, did you have the job already? Because if you didn't have it, it wasn't yours, you understand? Like, it's not like, I mean, I guess it'd be really wrong. Like, if the boss hired the white dude on Monday, and then on Wednesday he was like, yeah, just kidding. No, I'm giving it to the Latino guy over there. That might be a little unfair, right? I mean, I've had this job for 2 whole days. And then I would understand. But that's not what's happening. Plus, the dude that wrote me this email that said this about people of color taking all the jobs, like the next paragraph, his next statement out of his mouth was that black and Latino folks are lazy. All right, which is it? Because it can't be both. If you took all the jobs, I'm pretty sure you're not lazy. And if you're lazy, I'm thinking you didn't even take one job, let alone all the damn jobs. And I have this image whenever I hear this. White folks say this all the time, this victimology. Whether they're taking the jobs. I get this image in my head of like this white Iowa farmer, right? Wakes up at like 4:30 in the morning to milk the cows, right? Walks out to the barn, time to milk the cows, time to milk the cows, time to milk the cow. Opens up the barn, he's like, well, I'll be damned. These cows have already been milked. Who took my job? And then Andre shoots up from behind the barn and goes, it's me, Andre from Detroit. I took that shit. The hell do we think is happening in this country? That is not a thing. That is not a thing, right? But the thing is, if you have a politician that swears by that, and if you're in enough pain, right, you'll believe anything. You can put the blame on, you say we build a wall down here, everything will be fine. Really? You think that's how capitalism works? You just build a wall and then everybody gets a big raise because the capitalists are like, oh, they figured us out. Now we got to give everybody more money. No, capital will always cross the border. Capital will always cross the border in search of the highest rate of return. I know the president thinks that he can shut that down with some mean tweets at 4 a.m. That if he just sends out a tweet that says, you're not moving, you're staying here, that they're going to go, oh, well, I was going to make, $12 billion extra by moving the plant to Sri Lanka, but what the hell, the president says I can't, so I guess I'll stay. That's not real. Goods will always cross borders in search of the highest price, right? So if you got capital mobility and you've got goods mobility, but you don't have labor mobility, what happens? You actually rig the game against working people. Because if workers can't go where they get the highest wage, that hurts all working people, see? But we don't think about that, or we don't think about how we got in this political moment. The thing that's so important to understand about Trumpism, not Trump, Trumpism, is that it's really not a new thing. It's really not. Because the whole history of this country is the history of what we just saw happen. I keep hearing people say, we can't normalize Trump. We can't normalize Trump. Well, there are a lot of things that aren't necessarily normal and typical about Donald Trump and his rhetoric and some of the stuff he does. But there's other things that are excruciatingly normal, right? That have been typical and going on for a really long time, right? Because if you had to sum up the history of this country in one sentence with regard to race and class, you know what that sentence would be? That sentence would be that the history of America is the history of rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. That the history of America is the history of rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. It starts in the colonies when there were no white people yet. And you may think, that's a weird thing to say. What do you mean? Well, I mean, there were Europeans. We didn't call ourselves white. We hadn't come up with that term yet. We didn't have this pan-European identity, right? We hated each other. We spent most of history killing each other. The English hated the Irish and vice versa. Northern Italians didn't even think Southern Italians were Italian. The Germans hated everybody, and everybody hated their ass right back. There was no white race, and then in the colonies, all of a sudden there is. What happened to justify the creation of this thing? Well, nothing really, except that the elite in the colonies could look around mid-1600s, and they could count. And when they counted, what they saw was that they were way outnumbered. You take all the African enslaved folks, the European indentured servants who were just one level above slavery, and you take the other piss-poor Europeans who aren't technically indentured, but they might as well be. They're peasants. They don't have anything. And you put them all together, in most of the colonial period, they outnumbered the rich by 10 to 1, 15, 20, 30 to 1, had a handful of people that owned all the wealth, sort of like today. We got 38 people in this country right now that have the same amount of wealth as the bottom half of the country. 165 million people over here, 38 over here. So this thing has been going on a long time. So the rich look around, they see they're outnumbered, and they're worried, as you can imagine, right? They're thinking to themselves, holy hell, man. If they figure out that we're running a game on all of them, they're going to come and take our stuff, right? There's going to be a revolution, right? And they're going to come and take our stuff. And so we got to split these coalitions, because every now and then there would be rebellions that were cross-color, cross-racial. You would have Bacon's Rebellion as one, but there were others where you had folks of color and white folks joining together to overthrow the aristocracy, but the aristocracy can't have that, so they create this notion of whiteness, and they say to even the poorest European, you're better than even the best off black person. You're better than the indigenous. You're better, later on they would say, than those Mexicans, or better than those Chinese that we brought in to work the railroads, right? In other words, they created what W.E.B. Du Bois, the great sociologist, would later call the psychological wage of whiteness, right? The idea that, well, I may not have much, but at least I'm not black. At least I'm not brown. At least I got this right here, right? And the fact is, when you don't have anything but this will spend really well. You see, if you're rich, this is a bit redundant, isn't it? Like if you're rich enough, this is nice, but you don't have to have it. But if you're poor and you don't have anything else, this is the coin of the realm, and you will cash that check. And so all of a sudden, these white folks who were given the right to vote, at least if they were men, right? And they were able to own land, not much, but a little. And what they do, they put the men on the slave patrol to help keep black folks in line, see? Gave them a taste of power, not real power. They still didn't run the show. They still didn't make the laws. They still didn't own the bulk of the land, but they were riding around on a horse with a gun and a badge, and it made them feel big, made them feel strong, made them feel like they had a stake in this thing called whiteness, and those rebellions stopped. And the elite won. Rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. Fast forward, Civil War era, same thing. The rich white folks in my part of the world, in the American South, openly announce that the reason they want to secede from the Union and possibly go to war is to maintain white supremacy and the institution of slavery. They were very blatant about it then. We lie now and say that it wasn't about that. But back then we didn't have any shame, so we just said it, right? But the problem, see, was that if I tell you the reason we got to break away and go to war, and many of y'all might die, is because I need to protect my property in human beings. How do I get you to go fight for me when you don't own any human beings because you're poor? Because you do know the rich don't go to war, right? The rich don't go fight. They get poor people to do that, whether it's in the 1800s or right now. Rich people get doctors to write notes saying they have heel spurs so they can't go to Vietnam. And if you don't know who I'm talking about, you can Google that tonight and figure that one out for yourself. right? Rich folks never go fight. They get poor people to do it. So think about what a trick that was. If I just told you the reason we got to go to war is so I can keep my slaves, and you're a poor white person, doesn't even own any, why would you go fight for my stuff, right? You would, because I come to you and I tell you, man, if they get free, they're going to take your job. They're going to displace you. No, fool. They already displaced you. That's the point, because if you're white and you got to charge $1 a day to work on that farm, and the guy that owns the farm can get the black person to do it for free because they own him or her, right? Guess who's getting the job? Free is going to get the job. So actually, poor white folks would have been better off saying to hell with all this, joining with black folks to overthrow the system of enslavement that was bidding down the wages of all working people. But the psychological wage of whiteness kicked in, and divide and conquer work. Fast forward to the 30s, labor union movement. You got white labor leaders that didn't want to integrate the union because they had swallowed it. They had bought it, right? And they were saying things like, well, we can't integrate. My God, if we bring these black folks and these Mexican folk and these Chinese folk into the union, they're going to reduce the professionalism of our craft. No, fool, they're going to double the size of your union. And that's probably really helpful when you go on strike. Right? Because when you go on strike, if you don't have them next to you on the strike line, guess who the boss is going to replace you with? The very black and brown folks that you didn't want to stand next to and work next to, right? And then you're going to blame them for taking your job, not the rich white dude who gave it away just to split y'all off of one another and divide and conquer you. And here it is again, right? 80 years later, working on immigration, same thing, telling folks the reason they don't have a job is not because of Wall Street, which I beg to remind you, was not destroyed by Mexicans, documented or not, was not destroyed by black folks, was not destroyed by peoples of color. It's just the highest SAT having white boys in the banking industry, right? These all had business degrees. Like, God, you know they got to be smart. They had high SATs. And I know people get upset when I say that they were white. They're like, that's sort of racist. It's not racist. It's descriptive, right? And if they had been black or brown, all y'all would have noticed, everybody would have noticed. If it had been black folks or brown folks that took off with $13 billion worth of other people's money, or stole it, or lost it, or squandered it, if black and brown folks lose trillion, 13 trillion, if you lose that kind of money and you're black or brown, there's not another banking job that a black or brown person is ever going to get. Not even like a teller, not even like a drive-through window, right? Just no, you're not getting these jobs. White boys destroy Wall Street, lose trillions, and the result is what? That they keep getting bonuses. They keep getting bonuses. Nobody's going into the business schools and saying, look, white guys, I know you want to be bankers, but you've proven yourself incapable of the task, and we're giving those jobs to people of color now, or perhaps some women, but of all colors, but definitely not white boys. Right? Nobody's doing that. I'm not saying they should. I'm just saying we have a different standard, right? And that's the problem. We got people looking over here at the problem rather than over here where the problem is, because for 400 plus years, we've been told that the enemy was black and brown. That divide and conquer is not new, but it keeps working, and we have to push back against it, because if I don't push back against it and I'm a white person and I internalize all that shame when I'm struggling, my only options are either scapegoat somebody else, which means the problem doesn't get solved, right? And I'm still going to be hurting. Or the other option is I can destroy myself. And y'all know some folks are doing that because you've heard about the opioid crisis, right? They keep talking about this. These white folks in small town America that are getting hooked on Oxy, and then the Oxy, is not strong enough, so they're getting street heroin. It's interesting that we call this a crisis, and we have all this sympathy for it, because there was an opioid crisis in the 70s, mostly headquartered and located in black and brown poor communities, and we did not call it a crisis. We did not counsel rehab, education, and treatment. We counseled prison. We called people junkies, and we locked them away. And the same thing is true when the crack epidemic hits in the 1980s and 90s. We call people addicts, and we lock them away and punish them, not give them rehab. So all of a sudden, white folks, salt of the earth, white people in rural America are getting hooked. We're like, oh my God, we got to help these people. About damn time we have that attitude. About that time that we believe that, right? But here's the thing that's interesting about the opioid crisis and is related to the point I'm trying to make, right? Think about this. There was a study that came out shortly after the election. They were doing these studies to figure out what were the factors that were most highly correlated with Trump's support. And there were a lot of them, and they're hard to sort of disentangle. Sometimes they interact with each other. But one of the most highly correlated factors at the community level with Trump support, at the like county by county level, was the level of opioid addiction in that county. The more people addicted to opiates, the more white folks in particular addicted to opiates, the higher the level for Trump. Now, please don't misunderstand. I'm not saying that you had to be high to vote for Donald Trump. That's not actually my argument. Though it's a fascinating sociological query that the academics in the room might want to engage. Whatever. Good luck with that research. That's not my point. My point is that what is an opiate? Think about it. What is an opiate? Pharmacologically, just like its most basic pharmacological purpose is to do one thing: block pain, right? That's all it does. It doesn't solve the problem. If you got a crushed disc in your back, you're going to need surgery. The opiate is not going to fix your back, but it will get you through, theoretically, until you can get the actual problem solved. Same thing with cancer. They might put you on opiates, right? But that's not going to solve the cancer. You're going to have some other stuff done. So it's sort of like when Donald Trump comes along and says, I got a solution for your pain, that doesn't really speak to the problem. He's like a walking, talking, breathing human opiate, right? And it's killing the very people who take it, right? There's this study came out 2 years ago, found that there's been this huge increase in deaths in white communities, working class, non-college educated, middle-aged white folks, right? An excess death rate in those communities from suicide, opioid addiction, and heavy drinking that causes cirrhosis of the liver, right? Not natural causes. These are self-inflicted wounds. And it's happening in white space, not black and brown space in the same way. In the black and brown spaces, even though the death rates are higher, don't get me wrong, they're headed in the right direction. They're going down. The mortality rates are getting better. In the white community that I just described, they're getting worse. Why? Well, it's not because whites are hurting worse than people of color. Like I said, unemployment, poverty, wealth, any category you want to look at, white folks are better off than people of color, even though millions are struggling. The point is, white folks have been promised this. And if I've been promised this and I'm only getting this, I got to numb the gap between that because I don't know how to deal with that. See, people that never had any expectations learn how to struggle, right? If you never had any expectations, if you always knew that life was a hustle and you're going to have to grind to get where you got to get, then you don't give up when you run up against that wall. But if you were told that you didn't have to hustle, that all you had to do was work hard and play by the rules which people like you, after all, created, and then you hit that wall, you go crazy. You don't know how to deal with that. Well, you told me my life would be an 8 and it's only a 5.5. Oh, hell no, see? So I got to either take you out or I got to take myself out, which is to say that this privilege of expectations that the dominant group has had is really unhealthy. It's good as long as it all works out, right? But when the economy changes and it doesn't work out for a lot of people, it becomes a self-destructive thing. That notion that where you end up is all about you, uninterrogated, becomes a dagger pointed at the very heart of the people who created that myth in the first place. Back in April of 2011, there was a cover story in Newsweek, and they were interviewing these white guys who were like managers. These weren't even like working class. These were managers, right? And they'd lost their jobs in the recession. Some of them had been out of work for like a year, and they were freaking out, and they're walking around looking for jobs. And this one guy's interviewed, and he says, every time I'm out looking for a job, I feel like I've got a neon sign around my neck that says, unemployed lazy bum. And I remember thinking to myself, man, who told you that unemployed people were lazy bums? I know who didn't tell you, unemployed people. I'll tell you who else didn't tell you, black folks. I'll tell you who else didn't tell you, people of color generally. You know who told you that unemployed people were lazy bums? You told you. And people like you told you that they were lazy bums. And so the very ideology that you rocked all those years thinking that it would never come back to bite you on the ass has now come back to bite you on the ass, which is to say you'd have been better off to just listen to people of color from day one. Because they could have told you the system was a scam from the time that they were 12. They could have told you that it was a setup. They could have told you that it was a ripoff. They could have told you that it was a hoax, but we didn't want to believe it. And now we're the ones who are the least prepared for change. That's why you see these videos on YouTube, right, of like this white guy in Starbucks that has this meltdown because he got like bad service from a barista who happened to be black. Check this out. Go look for it. Look for white dude Starbucks meltdown. It'll come up. This guy's going just nuts because he got his latte with soy milk or something and I don't know. And he's yelling at her and he starts using racial slurs against this black barista. and throws out there, I voted for Trump. What do you think about that? I don't know, why the hell is that relevant to your order? Right? He just wanted to say it, just to like bust it off on her, and so he's yelling at her, using racial slurs, and then he goes on later to tell he feels oppressed. Look, here's the thing. If you think bad service at a coffee joint is oppression, you clearly have never experienced oppression, all right? If you think that bad service at the Starbucks is being oppressed, you've just proven white privilege. I don't even have to give my damn talks. I could just come up, show you that clip and be like, that shit right there, that's what I'm talking about, right? But this obliviousness is dangerous, right? Because that dude's having an existential crisis precisely because he's never had to come up against the idea that maybe his life wasn't going to work out quite the way he thought it was. See, James Baldwin had something to say about this too, and I'll close with it, and then I'll take some questions. Baldwin said, he was talking now, this time, first quote was about white folks. This next one's about black and brown folks, specifically African-American folks, but I think it applies to people of color generally in a system of white supremacy like ours. Baldwin said, I don't mean to sentimentalize suffering, but that person who can never suffer can never grow up, can never learn who they are. That man who has to every day snatch his humanity out of the fires of human cruelty that rage to destroy it, learns something about himself in the process that no school on earth and indeed no church can teach. He gains a sense of his own authority, and that is unshakable. Because in order to save his life, he is constantly having to look at the meaning behind the words, to read between the lines. And he goes on to say, when one is constantly having to survive the worst that life can bring, one eventually ceases to be afraid of the worst that life can bring. And I guess the point I'm trying to make to you is in this era of Trumpism, when folks are sort of popping off and afraid, know this. For the most part, people of color are not afraid because they've seen this movie before. And they are not the ones who were losing their minds at the threat posed by Trumpism. It's those of us who weren't ready. People of color have been trying to tell us for hundreds of years, hold the mirror up to our face and tell us that we have been lying not only to them but to ourselves. And only now are some of us beginning to believe it. For the love of God, let us start listening to those persons of color. Let us join with them, whether it is in the streets, whether it is in the classroom, or whether it is at the ballot box. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Now, something that is worth highlighting that, Tim Weiss is trying to insist on this in this video is that Trumpism as a phenomenon is not new at all. It is an amplification, It is the loud and apologetic version of what America has always been, And for Black Americans, America has always been police brutality, mass incarcerations, redlining, housing discrimination, economic exclusion, and even sometimes, or in many times before, voter suppression. These aren't like new headlines. They are historical constants. They're just that there are some people who didn't really think that was the truth that are now beginning to learn. And when white Americans today cry about government overreach, being unheard, economic decline and economic crises, about even the state violence with ICE snatching people off the streets, harassing people on the streets, showing up at people's homes without search or arrest warrants. Many Black Americans are simply just watching quietly, and they're saying we have seen this before, or even worse than this before, and we have lived this one before. And that's why you will notice that there are many Black people who are not shocked with these ICE raids, this aggressive policing, or this government indifference. ICE didn't suddenly become harsh. I mean, policing did not just suddenly become harsh. The system has always been harsh, just that it has been harsh selectively to some people, and some it protected. It looks like the US, there are people who are subject to the law, they're not protected by the law, and there are those that are protected by the law but are not exactly, subject to it. And now what we are saying is that it is expanding. This lawlessness looks like it is expanding, or it is becoming less selective. That therefore, it's even going, and it's now even affecting those that once were privileged people, and suddenly people who were once like protected, insulated, are now out in the cold. They're now also facing police brutality in form of ICE. They are also facing economic hardship. No, it's not only a thing of maybe Black people, maybe minorities. Yeah, something else that Tim Wise highlights here is the bubble of greatness, and this is where the slogan comes in. Donald Trump said, make America great again. But here's the real question: great for who? Because for many white Americans, well, America has been great. It was structured to benefit them. From the beginning of it, the housing loans were accessible, the job pipelines were always open for them, and then the policing was protective and not predatory. And the system was, the justice system was, well, forgiving. But how about for Black Americans, for example? This was a jungle, a dangerous jungle that just required survival skills. That is what America has been for Black people. So when Trump says, make America great again, he's speaking to a memory, but that memory is selective. It's good to some people and very, very bad to others. It really ignores the price, who paid the price for the so-called greatness. Well, America is great. America is a big economy. America is a superpower. But how did it get there, actually? And this is why Tim Wise says many white Americans don't understand history and don't know history. Because if you understand history, if you don't understand history, you think that this decline right now happening in the US is new. If you don't understand history, you think that injustice just started with Donald Trump, or last year, or just the other day. If you don't understand history, you don't realize that you don't realize that you are just shielded from it, not that it didn't exist. And history explains the present, and it can even predict the future. If you know history, then you understand why America is like it is right now. Black people have been saying, we got ourselves here. America has gotten itself here. And Black people have been saying, we told you not to vote for this man, but you went ahead to vote. Now, this is what we, because they have seen it before. And so they can foretell the future. And they can actually understand why the consequences are like they are right now. Now, something else that is also being highlighted by Tim Wise in this video is that why Black lives, for example, is not, such movements are not separatist movements as, they are meant to look like. And let's address this, because movements like this one, Black Lives Matter, for example, they're never about supremacy, and they're not about domination at any given point. When people had Black Lives Matter, and you had even some ignorant people respond with all lives matter, or even sometimes white lives matter, they misunderstood the very concept behind it all. They don't get the point at all. The phrase wasn't that other lives don't matter, really. It was it was saying that it is a call to pay attention to the lives that the system has constantly ignored. Not that any other person does not matter, but there is a people that we have not given attention. And it was a clear call for equal footing, equality, and fairness, not superiority. Black people are not asking to dominate America. All they're asking is for fairness within it, and then natural course will just take effect, But extremists, and especially white extremists, framed it as a threat because, equality always feels like oppression to people that are privileged. And this might be uncomfortable to say, but it's really true. you know. Now, let's go to this point also of white people are the problem. And why does it matter? And, you know, this is also something we're learning from this video. Now, and maybe here is where it gets controversial. Tim Wise, as white as he is himself, says that white people are the problem. He's not talking about about individuals as evil beings, but he's talking about the whole structure, the American system, from slavery to Jim Crow to redlining to mass incarcerations. This was all constructed by white political leadership. That we can all agree, White people have always been at the helm of leadership in America, and it was codified, it was legalized, it was enforced. And because white America historically benefited from the system, they are also protected from its brutality, obviously. So when the system becomes unstable and when the economy begins to shake, to falter, when institutions become more openly authoritarian, like we're seeing right now, when policing expands beyond the usual targets, some white Americans are shocked, yeah? But the shock reveals something that they didn't know. And that not knowing also is a form of insulation, And many people who voted for Trump did not necessarily love his policies. Actually, they loved what he represented emotionally. He validated. He kind of gave some validation to resentment. He weaponized grievance. He gave people someone to blame. Like immigrants are the problem in America, black activists are the problem, or the media is the problem. He gave them something to blame, somewhere to point a finger at. But here's the irony. And this is what I think. Trump doesn't love anyone. He loves power. He loves attention he gets. He loves being the center of gravity. Yeah. And he loves his dollars, I think. And he loves his circle of friends, rich friends only. He doesn't even care about white Americans per se. He doesn't even care about his own MAGA base, Now, even some of his most loyal supporters are experiencing and are crying about, economic hardships, the rising costs, and political chaos. And they're confused. It's like they're confused because they thought they were safe. They were electing their man. They thought that the system would only punish others, of course. But the system built on exclusion, for example. And I always say this. Will eventually consume broadly. It's like a bear that is used to eating other bears' babies. One day, when it doesn't find another bear's baby to eat, it will come back and it will start eating the first of its own babies. And, now the exposure is happening in real time. The bear is back home. It's eating its own babies. Now, if we talk about the silent observation we are seeing, and one of the most fascinating things happening right now is the quietness with black people. Many black Americans are not reacting with shock. They're not panicking at the economic situation, at eyes. They're not surprised. They're just quiet and observing, and they're just saying, "No, we're not fighting for anything here," because they have long understood that America was always capable of this. Police brutality has always been the norm. Now, when they see white people decrying, it's like it's not new, And when you've experienced like state surveillance, incarceration, economic discrimination, violent policing, and for many years, political instability then does not feel new. It's familiar, and this is what Tim Wise is trying to get, to get white Americans to confront, or maybe to understand. The America you're crying about is the America that others have been warning you about. You just did not listen, Now, something else is the responsibility to deconstruct. Yeah. And before I forget this, here's the final layer. If political leadership historically if white political leadership historically constructed the system, the unjust, unfair system in America, then white America are uniquely positioned to dismantle it, or are positioned better to dismantle the system that they constructed. That's not blame, that's leverage. That's taking responsibility. You cannot fix what you refuse to acknowledge, by the way, in the first place, and you cannot reform what you deny that it exists. You know, you cannot heal a nation without understanding how it was really built, how it became as ill or sick as it is. You know, so Trump did not create the disease. What he did is he revealed the symptoms of this disease. He removed the mask. He made visible what was already just in existence. Maybe it was hidden to most of these people, but it was always, you know, in the picture. Now, the question is really, will America confront its foundation? Because it is the very foundation that is the problem. Or will it keep pretending that all this is new? Yeah, that's a big question. And the truth is bitter. America was never universally great for everybody. It was great selectively for some people. And when selective greatness begins to collapse, those who were protected, they will feel obviously that they have been betrayed by their own system, you know. And maybe this moment, as uncomfortable as it is necessary, because exposure forces reflection. Reflection forces accountability. And accountability is the only path to rebuilding something more fairer, you know, more just, more inclusive. And the question isn't whether Trump is the problem. The question is whether America is finally ready to admit what it has always been. And more importantly, what it has become. Yeah, so that's my take. That's my 2 cents. That's what I have learned from this. I believe you also have enjoyed and most importantly learned from this video by Team Wise. If you have something you want to add, if you have something to say, do share with me in the comment section below. Give this video a thumbs up. You can share it as well. And I'll see you in the next video.